Billionaire visited school, found his son crying. Until he uncovers a horrifying truth. A young boy stepped into the classroom clutching his stomach, hollow with hunger, his legs trembling beneath him as if they could no longer bear the weight of his small, fragile frame. Then, suddenly, a strange sound broke the silence, followed by a heavy stench that drifted through the air, and a dark stain appeared across the pale fabric of his khaki pants. The entire class froze. Then came the whispers, quick and sharp, like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Curious glances laced with ridicule turned toward the boy. A student sitting behind him clamped a hand over his nose and shouted with a voice full of disgust, "What the heck? Did this kid mess himself in class?" And then the laughter erupted, swelling like a wave crashing across the room. Even the teacher, who had been writing on the board, turned around, her brow furrowed, the piece of chalk suspended midair. All attention fixed on the boy, who stood trembling in the center of the room. He tried to back away, wishing he could vanish into some hidden corner, but his knee hit the edge of a desk, drawing even more stares. A few students pulled out their phones, recording the moment that, for the boy, would likely haunt him for the rest of his life. The teacher stepped forward, her voice sharp, barely masking her irritation. "Noah, what's wrong with you?" But the boy said nothing. He simply stared down at the floor, his face flushed crimson, his eyes brimming with tears. The teacher bent down, gently lifted his shirt to inspect, then jerked back in shock, causing the nearby students to laugh even louder. A girl covered her mouth, giggling as she backed away, as if recoiling from something revolting. Another boy pretended to hold his nose, screwed up his face, and shouted for all to hear, "Oh man, he smells like a dumpster." The room unraveled into chaos, with laughter echoing from every direction. Noah, now barely holding himself together, stepped back until his spine pressed against the chalkboard, clutching the hem of his shirt with both hands. He could no longer see their faces clearly. Everything blurred into a swirling haze, except for the jeering, the laughter, and the cruel words that sliced through the air like knives. Then he collapsed silently to the floor, curling in on himself like a dry leaf crushed beneath a heavy boot. The teacher called his name again, but her voice was drowned in the noise. It was only then that a few students nearby noticed he wasn't responding. One of them cried out. He passed out. The teacher, suddenly stricken with panic, rushed to him and called urgently for the school nurse. The air shifted, moving from mockery to confusion, then settling into a thick, tense silence. But no one in that room could have foreseen what would happen just moments later. Down the long, empty corridor outside the classroom, a man walked with quiet urgency. He wore a tailored gray suit, his silver-streaked hair impeccably combed, his face solemn, his eyes sharp and unyielding. Each step he took seemed to hush the world around him. This was Steven Bennett, one of the leading engineers and technology investors in the Pacific Northwest, a man the press often referred to as the silent millionaire. He had just received a phone call telling him that his son, Noah, had lost consciousness in class under circumstances that defied belief. He stopped at the classroom door, opened it, and the sight before him struck him still. There, curled on the floor, lay Noah, surrounded by startled faces, some fearful, some guilty, all stunned into silence. Steven said nothing. He stepped inside, knelt down, and gently lifted his son. Noah's pants were soiled, his shirt rumpled, his breathing faint. Steven removed his own jacket and carefully wrapped it around his child, like a protective blanket. As the students stood frozen, watching in stunned quiet, Noah slowly opened his eyes, his lips trembling as he whispered the tiniest words, "I'm sorry." Steven held his son's small shoulders close, his gaze locking with the teacher who still stood motionless at the board. His eyes were so cold, so piercing, that she could not bring herself to speak. He asked nothing, because in that moment he already knew. And from that very moment, a terrible truth began to unfold. The truth about what had been happening behind the closed doors of a home that appeared flawless from the outside, and about a boy who had lived too long in silence and fear. If you've been listening and feel that this story has truly touched your heart, take a moment to subscribe to the Emotional Echoes channel. Click like and share this video so that the story can reach even more people. Emotional Echoes is committed to bringing you heartfelt stories drawn from everyday life, offering raw, emotional glimpses into the world around us, glimpses you may have never encountered before. Where are you listening from right now? Leave a comment and share your location so we can see just how far these quiet, tender stories have traveled across the map of human emotion. And now, we invite you to stay with us for the next chapter of this deeply moving and soul-stirring tale. Steven carried Noah out of the classroom in silence, his arms wrapped firmly around the boy, as if loosening his grip for even a moment might cause the child to slip away from him again. The gray vest still wrapped around Noah's small body, shielding both the stain and the shame he had just endured. Steven's footsteps echoed heavily along the empty hallway, each sound landing with a weight that reached the hearts of the students who stood pressed against the windows watching him pass. No one dared to speak, not even the teacher who remained frozen in place, her eyes still clouded with confusion. The black sport utility vehicle waited in the student pickup area. Steven gently placed his son in the back seat, fastened the belt, then pulled a soft blanket from the trunk and laid it over Noah. The air inside the car felt dense, filled only with the low hum of the air conditioning and the faint, unsteady breaths of the child drifting into sleep. Steven sat behind the wheel, one hand resting on it, his eyes lingering in the rearview mirror where Noah curled up like a startled fledgling. A long breath escaped him, heavy and caught in his throat. When the car finally moved, he spoke in a slow, low voice. "Does anything hurt?" Noah did not answer at once. He simply shook his head. After a moment, he whispered, "I'm hungry." Steven tightened his grip on the wheel. "Did you eat anything this morning?" Noah shook his head again, then spoke even more softly, as though he feared being scolded. There was nothing in the cupboard. Miss Melissa said the food was for adults. A quiet stretch filled the car. Steven said nothing, but his lips pressed into a firm line and his eyes grew colder. He remembered the morning before he left for work, the curtains in Melissa's room still drawn, her form curled under the covers. He had believed she would take care of Noah, as she had promised, believing that caring for a 10-year-old boy could not possibly be too much. Yet the foundation of that belief began to crumble. The car turned onto the stone-paved road that led to their home. The two-story modern house stood in a calm Portland suburb, its exterior neat and polished, white fences and trimmed lawns creating a picture-perfect facade worthy of a magazine spread. But behind the front door, that always closed quietly when Steven left for work, lay a world he had never truly entered. The door was unlocked and he pushed it open with ease. In the living room, the sofa was scattered with coats. A half-finished glass of wine sat on the table. Old snack plates and empty beer cans lay abandoned across the carpet. A pair of high heels were tossed into the hallway, and a purse lay open with receipts spilled across the floor. Steven said nothing. He returned to pick Noah up and carried him straight to his room upstairs. The small room with pale blue walls felt cold and bare, no toys, no family photographs, only a tidy desk, a dusty bookshelf, and a bed with a wrinkled sheet. He laid Noah down, pulled the blanket up, and stepped out. In the kitchen, he opened the refrigerator. Inside were only a few cans of energy drink, a half-eaten salad, a dried block of cheese, and a handful of wilted strawberries. No milk, no food suitable for a child. He opened the freezer and found only ice. Steven closed the refrigerator and turned toward the counter where a bowl of cereal sat untouched in growing mold. He checked the trash bin and found pizza boxes and fast food wrappers, but nothing that resembled a real breakfast for a child. He straightened slowly, his gaze settling on a framed picture on the shelf, a photograph of him and Melissa on their wedding day, both smiling brightly. Now the picture was coated in dust and the corner of the frame had begun to peel. He turned away, his shoulders heavy. He had once believed he was building a new home, yet now he saw he had only been acting out the idea of one. Noah had lived in this house for so long without being heard, without being held, without anyone asking him how he was each day. Steven walked back upstairs to his son's room. Noah lay still, eyes closed, hands gripping the blanket's edge. The quiet was so deep he could hear the ticking of the clock. Steven sat on the edge of the bed and gently brushed his son's hair, and a cold ache ran through him as he realized the child's hair felt stiff and unwashed, untouched for many days. The boy he loved so dearly, The one who never complained and never caused trouble had slowly withered right inside their home, and he had not known. Guilt crept into Steven's mind, heavy and slow, impossible to push aside. He rose, stepped out of the room, and closed the door with care. In that moment, he understood that the silence behind that door was the most dangerous thing he had ever underestimated, and he knew he would have to act before it was too late. That afternoon, when the sunlight spilled through the bedroom window and stretched across the thin blanket on the bed, Noah had still not fully awakened. The boy lay curled on his side, clutching a pillow with both arms, his breathing steady yet heavy, his thin face marked with exhaustion. Steven stood quietly outside the half-closed door, his hand resting lightly on the handle without pushing it open. He simply stood there, looking through the narrow gap, as if searching for the memory of a child who once laughed in the park, chased bright kites, and whispered tiny questions about the world into his ear. Now all that remained was a small, still figure, drained of strength. Steven turned away and walked downstairs toward his office, the space where he usually joined remote meetings, signed contracts, and managed staff. The room was soundproof, furnished with a black leather chair, a polished wooden desk, and shelves crowded with thick financial books. On the desk sat a small framed photograph of him and Noah when the boy was 4, the two of them smiling brightly on a sunlit beach. He had kept that photo there, but honestly, he could not remember the last time he truly looked into his son's clear young eyes. He lifted the frame, feeling his heart sink. Ever since Noah's mother passed away, had everything in this house grown silent. Melissa had come not long after, bringing energy, youth, and an outward shine of perfection. She always acted attentive in front of others, always spoke beautifully, but Steven now realized he had never once asked his son whether he felt safe living with someone who was still a stranger in a house that had once belonged only to the three of them. Noah had never complained. He did not cry, did not resist, did not demand a thing. He simply obeyed, quietly and completely. Steven remembered the rushed mornings when he would say only a brief "make sure to eat breakfast" or "have a good day." The response was always a small yes, eyes lowered, the door closing softly. No defiance, no tears, only a level of obedience that now seemed troubling. On late nights when he came home, he often found Noah asleep with the bedroom light still on and his book spread open on the desk. Steven had thought the boy was diligent. Now he wondered if Noah had simply tried to stay awake, hoping to hear a simple question such as, "How was school?" or "What would you like to eat this weekend?" Yet Steven had never asked. Melissa had often said that Noah was withdrawn, quiet, and evasive. She insisted that his son needed discipline, structure, and maturity beyond his years. Steven had believed her. He thought she made sense. So he buried himself deeper in work, convinced that providing money and securing the future was enough. He had once felt proud when friends praised Noah for being polite, calm, and never troublesome like other children. Now he understood that such compliance was not a virtue, but a sign of retreat, the product of long days spent unnoticed, the survival instinct of a child starved of affection. A hungry child learns not to trouble anyone. A scolded child learns silence. A child who is never embraced grows into the safety of a cold, private shell. That child was Noah. No one in the house knew what he liked, what frightened him, what he dreamed about, or when he had last laughed. A tightening pain squeezed Steven's chest. He left the office, climbed the stairs, and opened the door to Noah's room with care. The boy was awake, sitting on the bed, hugging his pillow, his eyes turned toward the window. He did not cry and said nothing when he saw his father. He simply nodded. Steven stepped in and sat beside him. He asked no questions. He simply placed a hand on the child's shoulder, a touch so light it felt like a whisper, as if he feared the boy might break apart. Noah did not move away, nor did he lean in. He simply remained still. In that quiet moment, Steven understood that this was the beginning of a long journey in learning to listen, in learning to reach into the guarded heart of a child who had grown too familiar with silence, and he made himself a promise that no matter how long it took, he would stay. Not out of duty, but out of love. Because that was the one thing Noah had never truly had enough of. That cold morning, With a thin drizzle falling from a gray sky, Noah slipped into the old ash-colored coat his father had bought him the previous winter. He walked slowly along the brick path leading to the gates of Pine Hills, his eyes sunken from lack of sleep, his stomach tightening now and then with the dull ache of hunger. Dinner the night before had been nothing more than a single slice of dry bread. Melissa had said she had no time to cook because she needed to call a business partner and that Noah should learn to take care of himself. He had not protested. He simply returned to his room, curled up on the bed, and let hunger gnaw at him through the long night. At 10 years old, he was used to that feeling. He knew that complaining changed nothing. Inside the classroom, Noah hurried to his usual seat near the back, a place he always chose so that he might stay invisible. He kept his head down, one hand pressed to his stomach, the other gripping his backpack. The room filled with the chatter of classmates, some talking excitedly about a new game, others showing off a set of colored pens newly bought. He did not join any conversation. He never did. Miss Peterson was at the board reviewing the previous lesson, her voice steady and measured. Noah felt the world around him begin to tilt. His vision flickered, and a deep twisting pain gripped his abdomen. He tried to sit still, to breathe calmly, hoping the wave would pass. It did not. It surged sharper, pulsing like hundreds of needles stabbing from within. Then, suddenly, a small sound broke free, dry and abrupt. Almost at once a strange odor drifted around his seat. At first, only a few nearby students wrinkled their noses. Then, a boy named Jaden turned and shouted, "Oh my goodness, who passed gas? This smells like a public restroom." Laughter burst across the room, loud and eager and cutting. A girl covered her nose and backed away from her desk, staring at Noah as though he were something foul. Another student pointed. "It is him. It is Noah. He must have had an accident." The laughter rose even higher, like a wave crashing against a cliff. Miss Peterson turned, frowning, and walked toward the back of the room. The students stepped aside, forming a loose circle around Noah. He remained seated, silent, his eyes brimming. He tried to stand and step out, but his legs quivered, and he stumbled against the desk, pitching forward. A boy nearby dodged quickly and then shouted as if he had escaped disaster, get away, that is disgusting. Who let him come to school like this?" Another student lifted a phone and recorded everything. The bright classroom lights caught every detail. Noah swaying unsteadily, his face flushed, the stain on his pants stark and undeniable. The teacher reached him, her voice stern yet uncertain. "Noah, what's happening?" But he did not answer. He bent his head and tears fell one by one. Then a voice from the back delivered the cruelest blow. Does his mother not teach him anything? Or is there no one at home to take care of him? The words struck him like a blade to the heart. The sounds around him faded. The room blurred at the edges. All he could hear was the pounding of his own pulse and a faint buzzing in his ears. He turned toward the classroom door, searching for a way out, but two students stood there laughing softly. One whispered just loud enough for him to hear. "Look at him. How pathetic." Noah could bear no more. He staggered toward the back of the classroom, avoiding every staring eye, and crouched beside the shelf of books. His knees drew up, his hands covered his head, and he said nothing. There was only laughter, whispers, and the steady gaze of children watching him as though he were some misplaced creature. And while everyone believed this was nothing more than an odd moment to laugh about at school, no one knew that in that exact second, a fragile part of Noah's spirit had cracked beyond repair. And no one knew that only a few minutes later, the classroom door would open, and the father whom everyone assumed to be distant would appear, and every trace of laughter would vanish, leaving behind the heavy silence of a truth about to be revealed. Noah still sat huddled in the corner of the classroom, beside the old bookshelf, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees, as if trying to shield himself from a world that had grown far too cruel. The sounds in the room gradually faded, not from compassion, but from the sheer exhaustion that followed a prolonged, merciless wave of collective laughter. A few students returned to their seats, still giggling quietly, still glancing back at the boy as though the show had not quite ended. But Noah no longer heard them clearly. The laughter had become little more than a muffled echo, muted and distant, like something being squeezed out of his mind. His chest felt tight, his heart pounded so fast and so loud, it seemed on the verge of bursting. His stomach twisted again, forcing him to hiccup in shallow gasps. His throat was dry. His head swam. His eyes began to blur. He tried to stand, but his legs would not obey. They felt heavy, numb, as though carved from stone. The air in his lungs grew thinner with each breath, and he felt as if he were sinking into a deep, cold pool. Then, all at once, the world went black. A loud thud echoed across the room as his small body collapsed to the floor. No movement, no response. A student screamed, "Miss, what's wrong with him?" The classroom dissolved into chaos. The same children who had mocked him moments before were now panicking. One student sprinted to the classroom door, calling for the nurse. Miss Peterson knelt beside Noah, her hands trembling as she gently shook his shoulder. "Wake up, Noah. Please wake up." She saw the pale blue tint of his lips, the sweat gleaming on his forehead, the waxy color of his skin as if all the blood had drained from him. It did not take a doctor to understand this was no ordinary fainting spell. Noah had reached his limit, not just from the gnawing hunger that hollowed out his stomach, but from the crushing weight of shame, fear, and months of quiet isolation. The school nurse arrived quickly, bringing a medical kit and a collapsible stretcher. After a brief examination, she called his father immediately. During those moments, the room fell into a stunned silence. No more laughter, no more sneers, only the quiet ripple of panic moving through the eyes of each student. Miss Peterson turned to the school secretary and urged her to contact Noah's parents immediately. The call to Melissa went unanswered. The secretary tried the second number listed in the school's records. Just minutes later, a black car screeched to a stop at the school gate. The man who stepped out needed no introduction. It was Steven Bennett. He said nothing as he approached, his eyes steely, his face drawn so tight with tension that no one dared approach. He walked straight into the classroom, where his son lay unconscious, surrounded by bewildered classmates and a teacher who stood frozen in disbelief. The sight struck him with full force. He could not fathom why his child had collapsed in a place that was supposed to be safe, why no one had intervened, why his son had been pushed to the point where his body simply shut down. Steven waited for no explanation. He knelt and lifted Noah into his arms, his hands trembling yet precise, cradling the boy as if he might break at the slightest jolt. Noah's shirt was soiled, his face ashen, his breathing faint. The nearby students instinctively stepped aside, silent and unsure. Some looked away, some bowed their heads. None had ever seen a father arrive like this, not in fury, but with an expression like iron and a sorrow he could not mask. Steven glanced once at the teacher, and in that single look, she found herself unable to speak. Then he turned, carried Noah out of the classroom, away from the school where the child had just endured the most humiliating moment of his young life. As the door shut behind them, silence remained, thick and breathless. That was not merely the moment when Noah's body gave way. It was the moment the masks inside the Bennett home began to crack, and the truth that had long been hidden began to quietly, irrevocably emerge. Steven moved quickly down the hospital corridor, his leather shoes striking the white tile floor in sharp, hollow beats that echoed the frantic rhythm pounding inside his chest. Everything had unfolded too fast. Only that morning he had been upstairs in a virtual meeting with his investment team, and only minutes later he had found himself in his son's classroom, staring at Noah's small body lying unconscious on the cold tile. Now he waited for the doctor's report in a room washed in sterile white, a place where every passing nurse and physician carried the same grave urgency on their faces. Steven was not familiar with this kind of waiting. In business, he controlled every variable. In negotiations, he always stayed one step ahead. But here, at this moment, all power and all wealth felt meaningless, while his son lay behind a closed door, frail and frighteningly still. He sat down, fingers interlaced, eyes lowered to the floor as if trying to gather the broken pieces of the morning. He tried to remember the last true conversation he had shared with Noah. It might have been last spring when they repaired an old bicycle together in the garage. Noah had laughed when a streak of grease landed on his nose, and Steven had smiled, ruffled the boy's hair, and promised him a new bike if he did well in school. But since then, his schedule had grown fuller, the meetings longer, the trips more frequent. He had convinced himself that providing comfort and security would be enough to make his son happy. The emergency room door opened. A nurse stepped out, followed by a doctor whose serious expression felt like a warning. Steven rose immediately. "How is my son?" His voice was hoarse. The doctor nodded and answered with calm restraint. "His condition is severely weakened. He has low blood sugar, dehydration, and signs of prolonged malnutrition. If he had not been brought in today, the consequences could have been very serious." Steven froze. His throat tightened. He could hardly comprehend what he was hearing. His child, living in a multi-million-dollar home with every resource imaginable, had collapsed from hunger so deep that his body could no longer endure. He clenched his hands and turned to the nurse. "May I see him?" She nodded and led him inside. The room was small, lit by gentle light. Noah lay on the bed, an IV line taped to his hand, his face pale but his breathing steadier. Steven drew near and pulled up a chair, his gaze fixed on the boy's fragile features. Noah opened his eyes slightly. When he saw his father, he turned his face away. The movement was small, but it cut sharply into Steven. He leaned forward, his voice breaking. "You are safe now. I am here." Noah said nothing, his lips pressed tight. After a long moment, he whispered, barely audible, "I am sorry." Steven frowned and looked at him. "Why are you apologizing?" Noah turned back toward his father. In his eyes lay a sadness too heavy for a child. "Because I embarrassed you today. Because I am weak. Because I am not like other kids." Steven stilled. His heart felt as though someone had closed a fist around it. He took his son's small hand and held it firmly. "No, you did not embarrass me. You are the most precious thing I have, and I am the one who should be sorry. I did not see. I did not listen. I did not protect you." The words left him like a confession, a truth he could no longer deny. For the first time in many years, Steven did not feel like the accomplished businessman, the man who solved problems and led people. In that room, he was simply a father who had arrived too late. But he also knew it was not too late if he began now. For the boy lying before him, for the long silence he had been forced to endure alone. And this time, Steven promised himself, he would not waste another chance. That afternoon, after the doctor confirmed that Noah was stable and could go home to rest, Steven guided his son to the car in a silence so careful it felt almost fragile. He opened the back door, supported the boy as he settled into the seat, fastened the belt, then gently pulled the coat up around his small shoulders. On the drive home, the sky remained gray, and scattered drops of rain tapped against the windshield like soft knocks on the memories both of them carried. Steven did not turn on the radio as he usually did, nor did he answer any incoming calls. He focused only on the road, his eyes drifting now and then to the mirror where Noah sat quietly, awake yet distant, staring out the window with a dreamy and troubled gaze. When the car merged onto the highway, Steven finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "If you want to talk, you can. If not, that is all right. I just want to listen." A long silence followed. Then Noah spoke, his voice trembling as though he had summoned every ounce of courage to let the words out. "Do you know that for the past 3 weeks I have not had any breakfast? I tried to eat old crackers in the cupboard, but they were moldy. Some days I just drank water and went to school. Melissa said I needed to learn to take care of myself, that if I was hungry, it was my fault for not knowing how to look after things." Steven tightened his grip on the wheel until his knuckles turned white. He did not turn around. His eyes stayed fixed on the road while every muscle in his body drew taut. Noah went on, as though a long locked door had finally opened and all the hidden pieces of his life were finding their way out. "I did not tell you because whenever you were home you were busy, and you always told me to listen to Melissa, that she was the one taking care of me instead of Mom. But you did not know she never hugged me, never asked how I was. When I said something she did not like, she would take out her phone, pretend to laugh, and say I was making things up." Steven felt his own heartbeat sting with every word, as if each one cut through the last remnants of his certainty. He had believed Noah's quietness was simply temperament. Now he saw it was the echo of wounds no one had noticed. Noah's voice grew softer, barely rising above a whisper. "Once when I had a fever, I lay on the bathroom floor all day. Melissa told me not to exaggerate. She ordered food for herself and ate alone. I only got water. Steven pulled into the slow lane and eased the car to a stop in a small parking area near a park. He turned off the engine and faced his son, his eyes steady and full of sorrow. I am sorry. I cannot believe what you have been through. I should have seen it sooner. Noah lowered his head, silent. He did not cry, yet his eyes shone red. Steven reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice roughened by regret. Nothing is more important than you. No contract, no company, no reputation, nothing. From now on, everything will be different. No one will ever hurt you again. Noah nodded slowly. He said nothing, but that single gesture felt like the first small opening after months of wordless endurance. Steven started the engine and guided the car back onto the road. Yet he knew this journey was not merely the drive from hospital to home. It was the beginning of a return, a way back toward one another, like the day he first held his son in his arms, but now with awareness, with awakening, and with a love no longer clouded by busyness or illusion. And quietly, he vowed that he would never arrive too late again. When the car stopped in front of the familiar iron gate, Steven looked up at the two-story house standing still in the gray evening mist, like a cold, hollow shell, no longer holding any warmth. That house had once been a symbol of his success, the place where he believed he had built a new home after an unbearable loss. But now, it was nothing more than an empty structure, where his only son had been forced to learn how to live quietly, to protect himself, and to endure. Steven stepped out of the car and opened the door for Noah. The boy climbed down slowly, his eyes fixed on the front door as though he were facing something that had haunted him for months. Steven placed a hand gently on his shoulder, a silent gesture of protection that said more than words ever could. When the front door swung open, a musty smell mixed with the scent of stale food drifted out, causing Steven to pause. The living room was in disarray, takeout containers scattered across the floor, dried coffee stains on the table, a dingy rug dulled with wear, and a throw pillow tossed to the ground. A drained glass of wine still sat on the edge of the sofa beside a pair of socks, and a television remote discarded as if thrown. Noah did not step inside immediately. He stood close beside his father, his eyes wary, as though this place had never really been his. Steven entered first, glancing around the room before heading straight for the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator. Inside were only a few dried slices of cheese, an expired carton of orange juice, half-eaten snack bags, and not a single trace of a home-cooked meal. The freezer held nothing but ice cubes and empty containers. On the counter, greasy dishes sat untouched from the day before, beside an unopened packet of noodles and a crumpled receipt for cosmetics. Steven slammed the refrigerator door shut, turned to Noah, and spoke with a voice steady but edged in steel. "This has been your kitchen for the past few months." Noah nodded. "I mostly ate bread, but sometimes even that ran out. Melissa said you gave enough money, so I shouldn't ask for more." Steven walked upstairs, straight to Noah's room. The small space remained neat to a fault, its tidiness bordering on sterile. There were no drawings, no comic books, no signs of a 10-year-old child living there. Just a single, worn, stuffed bear placed in the corner of a closet. He opened the wardrobe. Noah's clothes were folded precisely, but most were old, a few too short for his growing frame, collars frayed, sleeves riding up. On the desk sat a stack of graded assignments, the scores mostly decent, but with no comments, no marks of encouragement or care. Steven left the room and went to the master bedroom. He opened the door. The air inside was thick with perfume. The bed was unmade, pillows tossed around, the comforter wrinkled and pushed to one side, makeup items scattered across the vanity. Everything carried Melissa's mark. She was gone, likely the moment she received the call from school. Steven returned downstairs. Noah was still standing in the hallway, waiting. Steven sat down on the sofa and motioned to the spot beside him. Noah hesitated, then sat slowly, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Steven asked quietly, "How long have you been living like this?" Noah looked down at the floor and whispered, "Since Mom died. Things got worse when you started leaving more often." Steven lowered his head, the weight in his chest growing heavier by the second. For so long, he had not truly lived inside his own home. He had believed in the image of a neatly arranged family, believed in the promises of a woman he thought could restore balance. But the truth was that Noah had been surviving alone, in silence, in fear, and in scarcity inside the very house that should have been his safest refuge. There had been no warmth, no laughter, no embraces, no hot meals or end-of-day questions, only a concrete shell dressed up in expensive furniture and false reassurances. Steven looked at his son, eyes steady with resolve. This ends today. This house will no longer be a place you're afraid to return to. Starting now, everything will change, and this home will begin to feel warm again, not from the furnace, but from love, from the presence of a father who is truly here. That evening, after helping Noah settle into his room, Steven returned to the living room where the warm light from the ceiling fixture cast quiet streaks of gold across the worn carpet. He sat down at a small desk tucked beside the bookshelf, a place he passed daily but had never truly paid attention to. In the bottom drawer, beneath a few notebooks and old documents, was a small recording device that fit into the palm of his hand, one he had installed over a year ago. Originally, Steven had set up the home's security cameras not out of suspicion, but as a precaution, a way to monitor the house during long business trips. The system was linked to a private hard drive, and only he knew the password. He had never once reviewed any footage. He had believed, without question, that this home was safe, that this was a place where his son was protected. But now, in the frozen stillness of what should have been just another ordinary night, Steven opened his laptop, entered the password, and began watching recordings from the past 3 months. The screen lit up, and familiar rooms came into view: the kitchen, the living room, the hall, the stairs, all quietly preserved in slices of time. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Melissa appeared in and out of frame, pacing with her phone, eating dinner alone. But when Steven fast-forwarded to the late afternoon, around the time Noah returned from school, the story began to shift. He watched his son enter through the front door, remove his shoes, and silently hang his coat. Melissa was seated on the sofa, eyes locked on her phone, not once lifting her gaze to acknowledge the boy. Noah walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, then closed it quickly when he found it empty. He poured himself a glass of water, leaned against the counter, and stared off, far and blank. Then came a moment that stole the air from Steven's lungs. Melissa entered the kitchen. She saw the glass of water in Noah's hand, snatched it away abruptly, placed it in the sink, and said something sharp. There was no sound, but her face tight with anger, eyes cold, her finger pointing firmly toward his room, said everything. Noah did not argue. He lowered his head and disappeared from view. Steven continued watching. In another clip, Noah was seated at the dining table working on his homework. Melissa walked over, grabbed the workbook from his hands, and threw it to the floor. She snapped at him, lips moving fast, too fast to be gentle. Then she pointed to the stairs. Noah picked up the papers, pressed them against his chest, and walked away, shoulders slumped, his steps heavy like those of someone far older than 10. Each clip felt like a blade. There were no shouts, no bruises. But the look in Noah's eyes in those moments, that was enough. Enough to show a child slowly disappearing into himself. It was not the violence of raised voices or strikes, but the slow, cold erosion of spirit that came with long-term neglect. The quiet kind. The kind no one sees. The kind that wears down the soul. In another scene, Steven watched as Noah sat alone in the living room for 3 full hours on the day of his birthday. A small cake sat untouched on the table. Melissa passed by him several times without so much as a glance. Noah, after waiting in silence, finally rose, returned the cake to the refrigerator, and went back to his room. Alone. Steven paused the video. He leaned back in his chair, covered his face with both hands, and sat in the quiet of that moment. What he had just seen was not a series of isolated incidents. It was a testimony, a silent indictment, and no one could bear the blame for it but him. He had handed his child over to a woman he did not truly know. He had trusted charm, softness, politeness, the mask Melissa wore, and worst of all, he had mistaken Noah's silence for peace. Now the truth stood before him, frame by frame, gesture by gesture. Small moments, but filled with deep and lasting pain. Steven unlocked his phone and saved several clips. He did not do it in anger, not the kind that explodes. This was something colder, steadier, a fury laced with clarity, a line drawn in the sand. This was no longer about guilt, it was about responsibility, the kind a father must carry when he has failed, but refuses to fail again. Because now Steven had seen, and what he had seen would not be, buried in silence. Not this time. Not ever again. The front door eased open, just as the clock neared 8. Melissa stepped into the house, the sharp click of her high heels echoing across the wooden floor, accompanied by the familiar heavy scent of her perfume. She set her purse down on the table, still holding her phone, eyes sweeping briefly over the messy living room clutter she had never truly cared to clean. But tonight, something in the air was different. It was still, cold, pressurized, a silence that held weight. Steven was already seated on the sofa, his face lit starkly by the overhead light. Melissa froze mid-step. The look in his eyes no longer held the distant indifference she had grown used to. It was razor-sharp now, heavy with something she couldn't quite name, not anger in the way of shouting, but something deeper, steadier, more dangerous, a storm quietly gathering. She forced a smile, setting down her phone. "I heard there was something at school. Is everything okay now?" I was honestly surprised when I got the call. Her voice was light, casual, as if referring to a minor inconvenience. Steven didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly stood, holding a small USB drive between his fingers, the one containing the camera footage he had watched hours earlier. He placed it on the table in front of her, never taking his eyes off her face. "Would you like to see what's been happening here over the past 3 months?" Melissa froze. The faint smile on her lips faded into a flicker of unease. What do you mean?" Steven's voice dropped, each word deliberate, his tone low and quiet like distant thunder, warning of an oncoming storm. "I've reviewed the entire security system. I saw my son eating stale bread. I saw him getting blamed for opening an empty fridge. I saw him ignored on his birthday. I saw the way you ripped his notebook from his hands, how you shut him down when he was sick, how you dismissed him with your phone in your hand, and no trace of concern in your eyes. Tell me, Melissa, what do you call that, if not abuse?" She flushed, taking a step back. "I was just trying to discipline him in my own way. He's a difficult child, withdrawn, and sometimes I needed space too." Steven moved closer. His voice didn't rise, but it cut clean and deep. "You call this discipline? Starving him, shaming him, manipulating a grieving child until he learns to fear silence and to stay small just to keep the peace in a house that was never safe. That's what you call love." Melissa stiffened. Her eyes darted, her voice faltering. I thought you didn't care. You were never home. I was the one here doing everything. I tried my best." Steven didn't let her finish. "No, you didn't try. You exploited my absence. You took advantage of the trust I gave you. But I've seen the truth now. And from this moment forward, you are no longer part of my son's life." Melissa opened her mouth, as if to defend herself, but the look in Steven's eyes stopped her cold. In that single stare, every excuse she had ever leaned on crumbled to dust. There were no words left that could rewrite what he had seen with his own eyes. Steven turned and began climbing the stairs. Halfway up, he paused and looked back, his voice, quiet and firm, struck with finality. "You should pack your things. Tomorrow my lawyer will send the papers. I don't need an explanation. The only thing I need now is peace for my son." And with that, he disappeared down the hallway, into the room where Noah lay asleep, his face finally relaxed, free from tension. As Steven sat beside his son, watching the gentle rhythm of the boy's breath, he felt a calm rise in his chest. The decision he had made downstairs was, without question, the most right thing he had done in years. And in that quiet room, something began to awaken inside him. Not the resolve of a businessman, but the heart of a father who was, for the first time, truly seeing his child with clarity. When the first strands of sunlight slipped through the curtains the next morning, the house remained unusually still. Stephen had risen early and sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, not out of habit, but because he knew this day marked a beginning, a day to start again, for both himself and his son. Upstairs, Noah was still asleep. His face looked more peaceful than it had in months, his breathing even, his small body no longer curled in the tight protective posture of earlier nights. Stephen sat quietly for a long time, listening to the steady ticking of the clock, each sound a reminder of the years he had let slip through his fingers. Near 8 o'clock, the sharp click of Melissa's heels sounded from the upstairs hallway. She descended the stairs with a suitcase in tow, her expression stripped of its usual confidence, replaced by something resigned and uneasy. She understood that Stephen meant what he said. She understood her time in this house had ended. What she did not expect was that the first person to appear at the foot of the staircase was not Stephen, but Noah. The boy stood on the middle step, wearing an oversized sweater, his eyes still carrying traces of a half-finished sleep, yet shining with a clarity that startled even the morning light. Melissa hesitated. She looked at him and managed a strained smile. "I will be away for a while." But Noah did not let her finish. His voice was quiet, yet unmistakably firm, slicing through the heavy air. "You are not my mother." The words echoed through the house, settling into every wall and corner as if the building itself had been waiting to hear them. Stephen stood in the kitchen, gripping his cup with both hands. Melissa froze, her face paling. She attempted to smile, but her lips trembled. Noah stepped down one more stair, no longer avoiding her eyes as he had so many times before. "Since my mother died, I tried to accept you. I thought if I behaved, if I stayed quiet, you would care about me like Dad used to hope. But you never cared. You just wanted me out of the way. And now I do not need you to pretend anymore." Melissa took a step back. For the first time, something like remorse flickered in her eyes, or perhaps it was only fear at losing control. Stephen emerged from the kitchen, his expression no longer angry, but stripped of all remaining trust. Melissa dragged her suitcase toward the door without another word. When it closed behind her, it was final. Not a quick errand, not a night out. This was her last time crossing that threshold as someone who had once been welcomed. When the sound of her car faded from the driveway, Stephen turned to Noah. The boy still stood on the staircase, his slight shoulders held straight. Stephen walked toward him and lowered himself so their eyes were level. "Are you certain about what you said?" he asked gently, not pressing, only offering space. Noah nodded. "I stayed quiet too long. If I did not say it today, I think I would never say it at all." Stephen placed a hand on his son's shoulder, feeling for the first time in years the quiet strength that had survived inside that small, wounded heart. And in that moment he understood something profound. Sometimes a child does not need an adult to speak for them. Sometimes a child only needs the adult to be brave enough to stand beside them when they speak the truth on their own. That single sentence, simple as it was, marked the end of months of manipulation and silence, and it also marked the beginning of a new life, a life in which Noah could finally be himself, could finally be loved without condition, and would never again have to apologize for defending his own voice. That morning, after the door quietly closed behind Melissa's departing figure, the house settled into a silence of an entirely different kind. It was no longer cold, no longer heavy with the quiet tension that had once crept through every hallway like a shadow. This silence felt softer, like the calm that follows a long storm. Stephen sat on the staircase, right where his son had stood just hours earlier to speak up for himself. He looked up toward Noah's bedroom, where the door remained slightly ajar, left open just enough to become a space where father and son might begin to find their way back to each other. He didn't go into the office that day. He didn't check his email. He didn't answer the calls that kept flashing across his phone. He made one call, only brief and steady, to the board. He informed them that he would be stepping back from the current project for personal reasons. No one asked for details. No one dared. Because in all the years they had known him, they had never once heard him speak of family. Until now. Because now, for the first time, Stephen understood that no meeting, no contract, no deal could ever come before the life of a boy who had waited in silence for far, Too long. Noah woke later than usual. He stepped out of his room, eyes still clouded with sleep, and stopped when he saw his father in the kitchen. Steven, wearing a plain shirt and looking more human than he had in years, was hunched over the stove, fumbling as he flipped his very first pancake. When he turned and caught Noah's gaze, he smiled a real smile, not the polite curve of the lips he used in boardrooms. Noah didn't say a word. He just stood there, then moved closer. They didn't need explanations anymore, just a look, a presence, and a warm plate of breakfast waiting on the table. That, for today, was enough to begin again. After breakfast, Steven suggested they organize Noah's room together. They pulled out old belongings, wiped dust from photo frames, sorted through the books that had been untouched for too long. When Noah opened a wooden keepsake box that had belonged to his mother, he pulled out a handkerchief embroidered with his name, the same one she used to place on his forehead when he was sick as a toddler. He handed it to his father. Steven held it, his hand trembling slightly. He had forgotten that things this small could carry so much. It wasn't square footage or designer interiors that made a house. It was this. These little objects, worn and quiet, that carried memory and warmth and love. That afternoon, Steven took Noah for a walk to the neighborhood park. They sat on a wooden bench that Steven had passed 100 times but had never once stopped at. Today, he sat down beside his son not to talk, but to listen. Noah spoke of dreams, of his mother, of those first few days when Melissa arrived and he tried so hard to accept her. Steven didn't interrupt, didn't correct, didn't rush. He just listened with all the attention, all the care, all the presence a father could give to a child he had missed for far too long. As the sun dipped low and the day folded into evening, they walked home together. Dinner was simple, but warm. Steven stayed at the table, seated close to Noah, gently passing food, asking questions without pressure, just quiet interest. Noah ate more than usual. From time to time, he glanced at his father, as if to confirm he was still there, as if trying to believe this wasn't just another passing moment. Before bed, Steven stood in the doorway of Noah's room. The boy turned and asked softly, "Are you going on a trip again?" Steven sat beside him, gently brushing his hair with a hand full of care. "No, I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying, because I need to relearn how to be your father, and because you deserve a father who is here. Every day." Noah said nothing. He simply pulled the blanket up, closed his eyes, and let a small smile settle on his lips. And in that quiet moment, Steven understood that redemption doesn't come in grand gestures or perfect words. It comes in staying, in being there long enough, sincerely enough, to heal what was once broken, especially when you were the one who broke it. That Sunday morning, sunlight poured through the living room window, casting long golden streaks across the wooden floor. The faint scent of coffee lingered in the air like the quiet breath of a new kind of peace. Steven sat cross-legged on the rug, a weathered wooden box resting gently in front of him. Beside him, Noah mirrored his posture, his fingers lightly tracing the edge of the lid, as if unlocking a world that had been asleep for too long. It was their mother's box, the one that had quietly held the small tokens of a life, once full a life that had left too soon but never truly gone from the hearts of the two people left behind. Steven slowly opened the lid. Inside were a handful of old photographs, a brown leather notebook, a tarnished chain, and a birthday card Noah had drawn when he was 6. The boy picked up the card, his fingers following the uneven lines of crayon and scribbled hearts, soft with years and held together by memory. "She kept everything I ever made," he whispered, like she was afraid one day I'd grow up and forget I was ever small. Steven looked at a photo of the three of them taken in the park. His wife beamed into the wind, her hair loose and alive, her arm wrapped gently around a tiny Noah, while Steven knelt beside them, his face caught in a rare moment of pure, quiet pride. He brushed a thumb across the image, and his eyes glistened. "Do you remember how she used to laugh?" His voice was low, edged with something fragile. Noah nodded. "She laughed when I sang badly. She laughed when the pie burned. She even laughed when she was tired. But never, not once, if I looked sad." Steven said nothing for a long time. Then he opened the leather-bound journal. Her handwriting flowed across the pages, familiar and slanted. It was her journal entries about Noah, tiny moments caught in ink, his first crawl, his first word, the day he started school. One passage read, "Today, Noah asked what would happen if I wasn't here anymore. I told him, as long as you remember how much I love you, I'll never really be gone." Steven swallowed hard, the ache rising in his throat. He passed the journal to Noah, who turned each page with quiet reverence, as if listening to his mother recount the story of his childhood. He smiled at some parts. At others, his eyes turned glassy. "I remember how she smelled," he murmured, "like baked apples and lavender. I remember her voice reading to me at night. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear her whispering." Steven placed an arm around his son's shoulder, gently drawing him close. "These memories," he said, "they're not meant to be buried. They are part of you, part of me. They're what teach us how to love. And your mother, even if she's not here, lives on in every smile you give, in every small kindness, in every memory you hold." That afternoon, the two of them stepped into the kitchen. Steven pulled out the old recipe for the apple pie she used to make. He didn't remember every step, but Noah did. They stirred batter, sliced apples, added cinnamon, and slid the pie into the oven with a kind of anticipation neither of them had felt in a long while. As the warm scent filled the kitchen, Steven closed his eyes. He saw her again, glancing back at him over her shoulder, smiling softly, her voice saying that happiness is made of moments like these, simple, imperfect, but full. That evening, they sat together, sharing the first pie they had ever made, just the two of them. Noah looked up and said quietly, "I think she'd be really happy." Steven nodded. "She's smiling, I'm sure of it. And that smile, though unseen, will guide us through every day ahead. Because some memories, the more you speak them, the clearer they become. And the more they live in your heart, the more eternal they are." The next morning, just as the father and son had finished their breakfast and were clearing away the dishes still lingering with the sweet scent of last night's pastries, the doorbell rang. It was not loud, but something about the sound carried an unfamiliar weight that made Steven pause mid-step. He wiped his hands with the kitchen towel and walked to the door. Standing before him was a middle-aged woman with short brown hair, dressed in a professional coat, a file folder in one hand, and a small name badge clipped to the front of her blouse. Her voice was calm and clear. "My name is Elizabeth King. I'm with the County Child Protective Services. We've received a report concerning the well-being of Noah Bennett. I'd like to have a short conversation with both you and the child." Steven opened the door wider to invite her in, his face composed, though a faint crease of worry flickered through his eyes. He had known this day might come, especially after what happened at school and after Melissa officially left the house. In the living room, Elizabeth took a seat across from the two of them, opened her file, and spoke in a tone that was professional yet not cold. "We are not here to make accusations or to interfere hastily. But when a child collapses at school from exhaustion and shows signs of neglect, we are required to investigate. I hope you understand." Steven nodded. "Yes, I understand completely. And I'm willing to cooperate." Elizabeth turned to Noah. "Would you like to speak with me alone for a bit?" Noah looked at his father, and Steven gave him a gentle nod of encouragement. The boy stood and followed Elizabeth out to the backyard, where an old wooden swing hung beneath a maple tree whose leaves had just begun to turn. They sat there for quite some time. Steven didn't follow them. He remained in the living room, fingers interlaced, eyes fixed on the floor. He knew that what Noah said in this moment would carry deep consequences for the future of them both, and he also knew that if the boy told the truth, then his own responsibility would weigh even heavier. Nearly 30 minutes passed before Elizabeth and Noah returned inside. The boy settled beside his father again, silent, but with a calmness in his eyes. Elizabeth took her file in hand, and her voice softened, lowered with a gravity that came not from judgment, but from understanding. "It's clear to me that the child is not currently living in immediate danger. He spoke of recent changes, of your presence, and of your efforts to reconnect. But I also cannot ignore that there has been a significant period during which he lived in unsuitable conditions, both physically and emotionally. Steven nodded without looking away. I don't deny any of that. It was my failure. I was too consumed by work, and I believed in something false for far too long. I'm not asking for instant forgiveness. I'm only hoping for the chance to make it right. Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment, then replied, I will note your willingness to cooperate. We will continue regular follow-ups over the next few months. There will be appointments with a counselor for both you and Noah, as well as periodic evaluations at the home. Steven nodded again. I'll do everything that's needed. She gave a final nod, gathered her files, and left the house. When the door closed behind her, Noah turned to his father, his voice barely above a whisper. I told her everything, even what I was scared of, what I used to hide. But I also told her that you stayed, that you started listening. Steven pulled his son into an embrace. This time, it was not a hug to comfort or to soothe. It was the embrace of a father who had just crossed the fragile line between mistake and redemption. And he understood then that the presence of the unfamiliar woman had not been a threat, but a reminder. This journey of healing could not rest on emotion alone. It would require time, commitment, and the quiet courage to face everything that came before. That evening, after Elizabeth had gone and the house had slowly settled into quiet, Steven sat beside Noah in the living room, where the gentle glow of the lamp cast soft shadows across their faces. Outside, a light rain fell, its steady rhythm tapping against the window panes, underscoring the stillness inside with a hush that felt both tender and contemplative. Noah sat with his knees drawn up to his chest, eyes staring into the distance. He said nothing, but Steven could sense the weight of thoughts turning in his son's mind. It wasn't the conversation with the social worker that lingered most heavily. It was the silent question that hung between them, unanswered but deeply felt. Will you leave again? Steven placed a hand gently on his son's shoulder, and the warmth of his touch made Noah glance back at him. Looking into his son's eyes, Steven spoke slowly. I know the promises I made before don't mean anything to you now, and I don't blame you if you don't trust me anymore. I left you to live alone with your fears. I let someone hurt you in the very place that should have been your safest refuge. I was absent when you needed me most, and I was wrong. Noah didn't respond. He looked down, his fingers tightening slightly around the fabric of his shirt. Steven exhaled, the breath carrying both sorrow and resolve. But starting today, I'm not going to ask for your forgiveness with promises. I'll ask for it with time, with every day that I stay, with every meal I cook with my own hands, with every moment I listen without interrupting. I don't expect you to forget the past, but I hope that your future will have me in it for real. I used to think that providing money was enough, but today I understand that a child doesn't need expensive gifts if there's no one to play with, doesn't need a big house if it feels empty inside, and doesn't need a successful father if he's always far away, both in miles and in heart. Noah looked up then, his eyes glassy but clearer than before. I never hated you. I just thought maybe I didn't matter enough for you to stay. Steven's grip on his son's shoulder tightened just slightly, his voice catching. You are the most important thing I've ever had. I was just too late in realizing it. But from now on, I want to walk with you. Not as someone making up for the past, but as someone learning how to love again from the beginning. From that day on, Steven created a new rhythm for their life together. Each morning, he and Noah prepared breakfast side by side. They ate in a quiet peace, without phones, without emails. Each afternoon, he waited by the school gates, just like so many other fathers. And each evening, they read books, played board games, or simply shared stories about the day that had passed. Steven also attended every therapy session with Noah, never hiding, never avoiding, facing every question about emotion, responsibility, and what it truly meant to be present. One day, during a session, Noah turned to his father and asked, If I go quiet again, will you notice? Steven didn't hesitate. I will, because now I'm learning to listen with my whole heart. Trust, for a child who's been hurt doesn't grow from promises. It grows from patience, repeated quietly every single day. And Stephen understood that each moment he chose to stay was another brick laid on the long road to healing. That road would be long, and it would not be easy. But he would not walk away again. Because this time, he wasn't just a father who showed up, he was becoming the father worthy of being called one. In the days that followed, the rhythm of life inside the small house they shared began to take on a quiet warmth. The once tentative footsteps faded. The heavy silences that used to settle over meals slowly lifted, and most of all, the avoiding glances, the eyes that once darted away in fear or discomfort, were now beginning to meet with something closer to ease. Stephen started to notice the smallest changes in his son, and it was precisely these subtle shifts that meant the most. Noah no longer woke in the middle of the night gripped by nightmares. He slept more soundly now, and sometimes, just barely, Stephen could hear him murmuring in his dreams, something that had never happened before. He ate with more appetite, no longer pushing away his plate at the sight of unfamiliar food, no longer hiding bits of it beneath the table as if bracing for scolding. In the mornings, he woke up on time, joined his father in the kitchen to prepare breakfast, and sometimes even reminded Stephen not to forget to put the milk back in the refrigerator. They were such small actions, so easily missed, but for Stephen, each one carried the weight of something sacred. They were signs that Noah was beginning to open his heart again, that the wounds which had once quietly bled beneath the surface were finally, slowly, starting to close. Stephen continued with the therapy sessions, not only for Noah, but for himself. He listened carefully to the professionals, learning how to respond more thoughtfully, how to offer a hug at the right moment, how to be patient when Noah withdrew. There were still days when the boy would sit silently in his room for hours, clutching a photo of his mother, saying nothing at all. But Stephen no longer tried to break that silence. Instead, he simply sat nearby, asked nothing, offered nothing but his presence. And it was this presence without condition that began, slowly, to soften Noah's walls. One afternoon, as they were watering plants in the backyard together, Noah suddenly looked up and asked, "Dad, can I invite my friends over this weekend?" Stephen paused, a little surprised, then smiled. "Of course. Who would you like to invite?" Noah named 2 classmates, children he had once carefully avoided for fear of being teased. His voice was soft, but there was a quiet brightness in his eyes. "I want people to know I'm okay. And I want them to see our house isn't scary anymore." At those words, Stephen felt a sting in his eyes, a sudden well of tears he tried not to let fall. It was just one sentence, but he knew the depth it carried. For a child who had lived in pain to speak those words aloud, it meant that something deep within him had begun to shift, to heal, to believe again. That weekend, the house echoed with the laughter of children. Plates of cookies were set out, crayons and drawings covered the dining table. And Noah, bright-eyed and full of joy, ran from room to room, his laughter unguarded and full, a sound Stephen had not heard in years. He sat quietly in the corner of the room, watching without stepping in, letting the moment unfold on its own, and in his chest bloomed a rare and quiet peace. Wounds do not disappear in a matter of weeks, but healing can begin with the simplest things. A meal served on time, a full night's sleep, an embrace that arrives just when it is needed. And above all else, a father who stays and learns how to love the right way. And in those quiet, ordinary moments, real magic began to take shape. Not from some distant miracle, but right there within the same walls that had once held silence and fear. The same home, now slowly being rebuilt by love, patience, and the fragile, determined trust rising anew from 2 hearts that once believed they had lost each other for good. On a gentle Sunday morning, Stephen awoke to the warm, sweet scent of baked apple pie drifting through every corner of the house. He made his way to the kitchen, and to his quiet surprise, found Noah at the dining table, hands still dusted with flour, his face focused and intent. On the table sat a freshly baked apple pie, its surface still steaming softly in the morning air. Next to it lay a small, folded piece of white paper, neatly creased like a handmade card. Stephen stepped closer, opened the note, and paused for a long moment. Inside was a crayon drawing, simple and unsteady in its lines, but overflowing with emotion. It showed the two of them sitting beneath the maple tree in the backyard, sunlight slanting through the leaves above, and at the bottom, in uneven but unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for staying." Steven held the note in his hands, his fingers gently trembling, and the tears came without sound, slipping down his cheeks in quiet release. He said nothing, only moved closer, wrapped his arms around his son, and held him close, feeling the small, steady heartbeat pulsing peacefully against his chest. After all the losses, the pain, and the missteps, what remained was not blame, not bitterness, but forgiveness, patience, and a love that had endured in silence and taken root in persistence. The story of Steven and Noah was not only one of redemption, but a reflection of the small, enduring things that matter most in life. Sometimes healing begins not with grand gestures, but with one person choosing to stay, to listen, and to simply be there. In a world that moves too fast, that prizes success and achievement above presence and tenderness, it's easy to forget that children do not need wealthy fathers. They need fathers who are present, not gifts wrapped in ribbon, but dinners shared at the same table, not perfection, but hugs that arrive right on time, and eyes that listen even in silence. And perhaps it is in these quiet, unassuming moments that we truly discover the meaning of family. If this story has touched something in your heart, consider subscribing, liking, and sharing this video to help spread these messages of compassion and humanity to others. At Emotional Echoes, we strive every day to bring you honest, moving stories that speak to the deeper parts of who we are. And what about you? Have you ever walked a path of healing like this? Have you ever needed someone to simply stay and listen to you? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. We're always here to hear what's real and what's true from your heart to ours. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. May you carry with you strength, peace, and gentle days ahead. Farewell, and we'll see you again in the next video from Emotional Echoes.